Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today for our first DACA meeting of the year. We have some good presenters coming up over the next couple months. Today, we have Tondi here to speak to us about finding efficiencies in testing. If you have a question at any time, feel free to either put it in the chat and Dusty and I will watch that, or just take yourself off the mute and go ahead and ask the question that you have. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Melissa, and we can get started.
All right. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited to share some of my thoughts. And if you've ever heard me speak before, or probably heard any other speaker before, we welcome chats, conversation, feedback, right? So I would encourage you to certainly share your thoughts or ask your questions there. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and start. So this talk really kind of came about over the years and years that I've been in software testing, quality assurance, quality engineering, and specifically a lot of themes came out of, what's the need for efficiency? How come we've been inefficient in the past, and why do we feel like there's never enough time? And so over the years, and after kind of fine tuning approaches around building quality engineering teams, or kind of transforming testing teams or quality assurance into quality engineering teams, these themes were still very much resonating throughout. So the idea here is we're going to talk about the kind of that whole adage of like, why do we feel like we never have enough time? We always think that there's more and more and more to be tested. And that's kind of almost a nagging, in some cases, characteristic that we have, that we always wish that we had more time to not just do testing, but in the normal fact of agile testing teams or even non-agile testing teams, never enough time or real efficiency or optimization around all of our activities, but generally around our testing activities. And one of the ways that we kind of have uncovered some of that stuff is we tend to emphasize specific types of testing activities. So we're going to talk about those specific types of testing activities that we tend to emphasize that may be leading into us being inefficient or non-optimized, or having this kind of gnawing reaction of we never have enough time to do things. And then we're going to talk a little bit about like, where are we finding some inefficiencies? What are the things that we've either introduced into our own testing or quality assurance, quality engineering lifecycle, and how do we first fix them and find them? And then more importantly, and this is really kind of the crux, is that, when we start looking at inefficient activities that we've been doing and address them by either removing them or fine tuning them to the point where they did not necessarily take as much time or didn't add as much value as we thought previously, well, then we should have a way for us to kind of gain back some of that time. So we're going to talk a lot about these areas specifically. And again, as mentioned, I won't be able to see the chat, but if you do have questions or want to share your thoughts on any of these topics, I welcome that. And I certainly encourage you to do so. So just a little bit about me. I really don't want to focus too much on me. It's more important for us as a group to kind of learn from each other. But I've been in the QA, QE, and Agile spaces for the bulk of my career, high majority of my career. So coming up on 26 years or so. Started out as a software tester, then quality assurance, and then over the last 12 to 15 years or so, I've kind of been in that more management leadership role. And one of the things that I really kind of talk about specifically around quality engineering and talking about the differences between more traditional quality assurance or software testing and where the differences are within quality engineering. So I've got a lot of talks and kind of published articles on that. But as I focused on quality engineering for the last 12, 15 years or so, I've also kind of spent all of that time focusing on kind of these three tenets of efficiency, hence the talk for today. Innovation, I think, we as we are and should be technologists, which means that innovation should be one of those guiding principles in everything that we do as technologists, and especially looking at the teams that we generally support, which are software engineers or developers, programmers. And so innovation and the modernization of existing or new processes that we should be looking at is also kind of one of those tenets that I focus on. And then, making sure that there's a culture that not only exists within the quality engineering team, but within project teams or agile teams, and then expanding that out into engineering or IT organizations. So when you have a culture of quality, and where quality engineering or testers are considered equal members of the team, then all three of these tenets really kind of play nicely together. So I'm always kind of passionately focusing on all three of these tenets, regardless of which company or role that I'm in, but have been focusing on these in most of my leadership. So with that said, why do we kind of have this nagging sense of there's never enough time? Oh, I wish I had more time to do this, or we ran out of time to do this because I got something late from a developer, or the acceptance criteria wasn't really well formulated and it wasn't well understood. And so by the time a card or a story got to me to start testing it, we had to kick it back because the AC wasn't correct or something, right? So there's a whole bunch of different reasons, and I'm sure that you could share many of these reasons. But as we kind of talked about as I was building this content over the years, these kind of areas really have spoken out, and those were very really kind of thematic, regardless of the industry or folks that I was talking to gather data to eventually put into this slide deck. These were some of the major areas that kind of were thematic across. So we decreased schedules, right? So we may have thought that we were following more of an agile process where we would properly groom and refine and plan work so that then the team could set that date, given all the information that we would gather in a lot of those sessions. But a lot of times we sometimes don't have that luxury of being able to dictate a date of delivery based off of what we know and all those grooming. Sometimes those dates are given to us, right? And then if everything does not work perfectly throughout, which we know never happens, we winds up having some sort of a decreased schedule, whether it's with the development time, whether it's with the refinement and planning time that we thought we had, and certainly with the testing time, because of course, where we sit in the whole delivery cycle, we tend to be, one of the last teams that holistically touches that solution or that code that's coming and eventually be deploying out to production. But we know that in a perfect world or an imperfect world, our schedules will almost always be decreased, right? So it's not necessarily that we're going to say, well, we won't decrease schedules, but how do we wind up acclimating and adapting when, not if, but when our schedules or our time has been decreased versus when it was previously planned. A lot of times decisions are made in a silo. And specifically, you may see this if you have kind of the three amigos that we like to say on an agile team. You'd usually have product, software engineering, and quality engineering or testing as kind of the three amigos of that should represent most of the teams. You may have other folks that make up a typical agile or project team in your organization. But a lot of times when some of those say acceptance criteria or stories are beginning to be written by a typical product owner or product manager, a lot of times you may see that you may watch or witness or observe conversations ad hoc happening between, say, a product manager or owner and an individual developer, right? And a lot of times decisions, whether the intent was there or not, those decisions are actively being made. And again, it's not necessarily to stop those ad hoc and kind of informal conversations that generally result in a lot of really good information. It's what happens when decisions are made in a silo, when not all three amigos or whatever that number is in your typical teams, when they are made in a silo. What do we need to do, and how can we help address and make sure that that information that's being shared aren't being made in that silo? I do see a question in the chat. Is there something that I might be able to answer here? If not, I'll move on.
What
Okay.
risks do you encounter most often and why? best ways to mitigate, what factors into them not being vetted appropriately?
Yeah, and that's a good question, right? So the risks, we're very much, and actually, we're going to talk a little bit about the risks in this one. And I'm reading this chat as we see. So risks, I think, are definitely topics that I suggest having those in a grooming or refinement session. I'll kind of talk a little bit about what that looks like on kind of refinement guidelines that I've put in place. But yes, certainly risks there, and not being vetted appropriately or with enough emphasis. They generally tend to happen in kind of one big meeting that we call refinement and grooming, and then we tend to not really come back and address those in there. So we'll talk a little bit about how we specifically address this this particular item of why we aren't efficient or why there is never enough time in there. So a great question, and we'll make sure that we address that later on in a couple slides. If you're experiencing maybe not having an appropriate or equal seat at the table, so to speak, that is going to mean that information, we may not be pulled into the appropriate conversations or meetings because there is some sort of an expectation that our role or our testing activities don't really start until the development is complete, right? So when we don't have that equal seat, or we're not being considered or seen as an equal member of our team, we're going to absolutely introduce efficiencies, right? And as I mentioned, the list goes on. As mentioned, you probably have a list that's very unique to your situation or your company. But the idea is that any of the lists that you would add to that of why we don't have enough time or why do we tend to be inefficient or not optimized, hopefully a lot of these kind of lessons and items that we're going to talk about will address those. So as we move into testing activities that we tend to emphasize, a lot of these should feel and look very familiar to you, right? We have test planning or management, and sometimes those result in documents. Sometimes there's a separate test plan document that we create that kind of talks about what we're planning on doing, what we need in order to do our job. A lot of times in the management standpoint, we are writing scripted tests, whether we're writing them in an automation framework or a tool, or whether we're writing those via a more traditional test case management system. We're scripting tests. And we spend a lot of time doing that, especially in the test planning method, right? So again, none of these items should look they should all look very familiar to all of us if we've been doing a traditional testing, quality assurance, quality engineering job for the last couple of years. Other activities that we tend to emphasize are planning stories, right? And so we get in there, we vet out requirements or acceptance criteria, and we tend to spend a lot of time making sure that, say, the acceptance criteria is adequate for and this is kind of where we become a little bit inefficient, is making sure that the developer who is responsible for coding up the solution understands the acceptance criteria. But a lot of times we don't really have holistic conversations about acceptance criteria, and not only the acceptance criteria that's going to be part of that story, but also acceptance criteria on what its real purpose is. And I'll talk a little bit about, my opinions on what the acceptance criteria really should be, and how we've tended to use them in the past, but really what we should be guiding conversations on, assuming that we are actually part of ceremonies or meetings or conversations that are where we're actually talking about requirements or acceptance criteria. And then as we kind of move down the line, of course, we're, our bread and butter, right? We're testing those stories. We tend to focus a lot of time on making sure that the acceptance criteria is met. And that's one of the first things that we tend to test when we are looking at a story. And that's, again, assuming that acceptance criteria exists in the story. And that it's well understood and that it's being used in its proper way, right? So a lot of times one of the first things that we do when we get a story or a card that comes in our in-test column is that we wind up going through the acceptance criteria, right? And again, nothing wrong with that. This is testing activities that should feel and sound very familiar to all of us. And then as we're as we are, testing, we're finding and writing up bugs. We may be spending a lot of time documenting the bugs or the issue reports in there, or we may have, meetings where we're actually going through a list of those, right? And so a very important activity that we know, and more importantly, finding and writing up bugs is really kind of under the umbrella of sharing the information that we are discovering in all of the phases, not just necessarily the time or the phase where we're actively testing and exploring the software solution or the solution that's coming from our software engineer counterparts, but we're sharing all of our information so that we can instill or have those types of quality conversations, and not just as it affects the actual testing. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the reporting on all those testing activities in whatever way. Sometimes we are responsible for creating a dashboard or a status report, a daily one or a weekly one, and it really just, it comes up to whatever the expectation is or had been on the information that we're sharing on all the testing activities from the quality engineering or testing team. So when we start looking at, now when we look at some of these activities, where can we find, or where do we tend to find some of these inefficiencies? And again, the result here is we look at some of these very popular types of activities and not necessarily stop them. In some cases, though, we might choose to do that, but to see where we can become much more optimized in doing that. So when we look at like test planning and management, and this is a story that I like to tell all the time. When I first started out my career, I was very, very, very proud of the fact that I wrote extremely detailed test cases, right? And we used to use this term, we still may use this term, but and this may sound familiar to some of you, where anyone off the street could come in and actively test our platform, our software, by simply following these very detailed test cases, right? And so where I was really proud of the fact that anyone off the street could pick my test cases up and start running them and just replace me as a tester, of course, that wasn't the best use of my time, because where I was spending a lot of time detailing those test cases, I was actually missing a pretty big activity of exploring the software, right, and actually testing the software. So a question that we kind of tend to ask is, how much detail is enough, and how much do we as leaders, whether you are or a manager or director, or, in your team, or you are responsible for people, or even as a leader of one, understanding the type of detail that is not only enough for your particular project team or squad, but also your organization, right? And there has to be some sort of balance between writing very detailed test cases, because quite honestly, there was never a situation that arose in my entire career of writing very detailed test cases where somebody off the street actually needed to come in there, right? It was people that were assisting in that testing that had a decent, or in some cases, a very intimate knowledge and understanding of how that software should be there. So they didn't actually need the detail in there, but that was a time waste for me and my team, because I was focusing on the wrong type of activity, where I should have really been focusing on more of the exploring and providing more information back to the team. So you may find yourself in that situation. You may be kind of in this test case review, right, where there's some sort of an approval process to say, well, before we say that something's ready to be tested, or we want to take a look at how you are planning on testing, right? And sometimes that results in a big test case review meeting where the entire team or subset of the team is looking at a screen and they're looking through the test cases that we're going through, right? And there might be a value in that for your particular team, but unless that same type of activity is also done at the product management level and at the software engineering level, we may want to looking at those test case reviews and seeing how much value do they actually add, if that's something that you or your team is responsible for doing. And then, as I kind of mentioned earlier, test plans as a separate document. A lot of, in some cases, and especially highly regulated companies or industries where a third party or a need for that test plan documentation is actually required. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about more of, one person from many, many years ago knew that there was a test plan document, and that was something that just was created as part of a deliverable for a team. And no one really bothered to ask how valuable or how much value that particular document is adding. And we just continued to produce those and not really knowing whether or not they were providing value. So another area of where we tend to find some of these inefficiencies is we duplicate testing efforts, right? And so, we definitely want to give credit where credit is due, but more importantly, there are a lot of great developers and software engineers that I've worked with, and you probably are currently working with great software engineers that they do their own quality checks before they say that their code is done, and even before that they're turning it over for code review. There's a difference between document and unit and integration tests, which may or may not be standardized within your software engineering organization. But what we really want to get down into the meat is by forming a relationship and a collaborative relationship with our other team members. We're going to get to know what those devs or software engineers are actively testing on their own in order to satisfy their quality checks and maybe their organization's quality checks. But one thing that we know is that a lot of that type of testing is not documented because it's really them kind of poking through and exploring their own stuff themselves. And why would they write more formal tests outside of their unit and integration tests? But we know that those areas are being looked at. And we also know that those may be inconsistent from developer to developer to developer, even within a project team. So understanding and knowing your developers and individuals to see what types of quality checks they're doing on their own is really a key portion of understanding the types of testing that is happening within your project team. But more importantly, so that we can focus, and this kind of goes back to that question around risk. We know that the areas of risk that we should really be focusing on are the ones that aren't previously being looked at or don't have documented or undocumented tests associated with it. And the only way that we'll know that is when we do forge those relationships and have those conversations and ask or have devs show what they did to satisfy not only the AC, but just the general quality of the solution that they put together, right? So we want to avoid duplicating testing efforts, and we want to get a lay of the land and a landscape and inventory all of the testing that's happening outside of the traditional quality engineer or tester on that team. And ways that we can do that is by asking and talking about it and introducing that kind of topic in our refinement meetings. And then, we focused a little bit more on the software engineer, but I've also worked with fabulous product owners or product managers that when that code is put into that first test environment, they're actively testing alongside of QE or the tester on there. And we want to also make sure that we're not duplicating their testing as well. So we want to make sure that we're capturing all of the testing that is either planning on being done by the team during that phase or things that individuals tend to be doing there. And so when we start looking at risk-based and context-driven techniques, which both of those are in play here, we really have to be able to take a landscape and understand what testing is happening outside of our QE team so that when we do put that testing strategy together, that we are primarily focusing on those high risk, low, non-touched areas first, because we know that those are going to likely result in bugs that were not previously fleshed out or known before. So things of things that the role of the tester or quality assurance or quality engineer have tended to introduce around inefficiencies is that we tend to become an enabler, right? And or sometimes we may call this the martyr with schedule or scope creep, right? And so my first instruction here would be give it up. And I'm talking about the enabler. It really is what kind of makes us awesome here, right? Like, and this may sound very familiar if you're in a 1 or 2 week or 3 week sprint. We see a lot of those stories kind of come our way towards those, for last 3 or 4 days of the sprint, right? And so the expectation is that well, we all as a team committed to not only dev completing all of this work, but also testing it to the point where ideally it could be or should be able to be shipped at the end of that sprint. I mean, that should be what we are actively as a team getting to. That should be the goal of a sprint, is that we could ship. We may not choose to ship, but we could ship that, right? And a lot of times what winds up happening is in a 10-day sprint, we get a lot of that testing and those stories are kind of flowing our way towards those back last 2-3 days, right? And so which means that we wind up spending the last couple of days of that sprint, maybe working a little bit longer, maybe a little bit in the evenings or the weekend to make sure that we are not the team that has a whole bunch of cards sitting in our column towards the end of the sprint, right? And that honestly makes us awesome. That means that we are being as much of a team player as we can. But as you can tell here, it also is enabling some maybe not so great behavior from other members of our team. If the devs are expecting that we will just simply make up the time at the end of the sprint, then there really isn't a lot of motivation for us to help them be efficient in their delivery. So we'll talk a little bit about like, what some of the ways that we've introduced that would help that if you're experiencing that, in typical sprints where most of that work is coming to the QE team towards the end of the sprint, where it's not equally balanced throughout those 10 days of the sprint. And really that winds up enabling bad behavior that really should be vetted out and talked about both at a retro, but also actioned on with the squad or with the project team so that we can be efficient, not only as testers, but efficient as part of our entire project team there. Another way that we find inefficiencies are QE or QA only sprints or cycles where, we have, where we may say, okay, all the dev work is going to happen in sprint 1. And then all of the testing work for that sprint is going to happen in a separate sprint. Or, okay, we have all of dev complete. We now are kind of finishing up testing all these stories and we're getting ready to deploy. We're getting ready to release a big chunk of work into production. A lot of times we have a hardening sprint or hardening phase, or we have a regression type of cycle where there's no active development work happening, but we're ensuring QE specifically is ensuring that no regressions have been introduced, and we tend to measure out a certain amount of time. It could be a week, it could be 3 days, it could be 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever that looks like in your organization. But we say, okay, we're going to have these QE or testing only types of cycles, and that removes the developer or the software engineers from really being intimately familiar with what's actually happening. A lot of times in that case where it's, QA or QE only type of timeline, the developers are already starting work on the next sprint or the next release, and they're already starting to think about and probably have conversations about. But when we have these kind of artificial inflated QA only types of sprints or cycles, we are not actively able to partake in those kind of conversations. So if you start tacking in more and more releases where we get further and further away from our software engineer counterparts, well, then we're constantly playing catch up and we're actively not being included in conversations because we're heads down testing for regressions, right? So one thing that I tend to say on this one is that a good flag, and we this is depending on the maturity of your project team, a good flag for this is if at any point from the time a developer has either started writing that code or ideally has been dev complete in that code, we really want to make sure that no more than 2 days has elapsed by the time that we're able to start testing that. And 2 days is kind of that magic number where, and I kind of use this analogy too, if you were to ask me, the day, March 1st, what did I do? What was the from the time I woke up until the time I went to bed on March 1st, it'd be really hard for me to give you the detail of that. I'd have to go back and look at my calendar. I'd have to really think about, okay, that was 8 days ago. Good Lord, how I can't get there. If you were to ask me what I did 2 days ago with relative and high confidence, I would be able to give you a lot of detail. And so when you think about that 2-day kind of span, when we're actively testing a developer's coding solution, we want them to be fresh and have their eyes in there, right? So when we start introducing QE only sprints or cycles, we're removing that very valuable time frame where it's fresh in their mind. And anytime we go past 2 days, we're automatically introducing an inefficiency because we have to then context switch and go back to really understanding the detail of what we were doing, rather than being able to tap into immediate type of timing where we can get active and fresh memories from those devs when we're testing their code. So another place that we find inefficiencies is not taking advantage of the agile ceremonies, right? Like our typical usual suspects are planning, stand-ups, retros. You may have others, but these are pretty typical agile or sprint kind of ceremonies that we tend to do. Anyone that's practicing any type of flavor, these are generally types of meetings and stuff that we have in there. And so when we don't take advantage of those, and we tend to have like the leader, the scrum master, or the product manager kind of running these things, and they're very scripted in there, some of the activities that we want to really vet out might get overlooked in there. So we want to make sure that we are taking advantage of agile ceremonies, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like as we now move into how are we going to fix these, right? So we talked about inefficiencies that have either crept into our day-to-day or our operations model, or that are actively being done in there. And so now here's some ways that we can really talk about how can we fix them and address them so that we become much more efficient and optimized. So test planning, right? So I like this rule of thumb of ABT, always be testing. And that doesn't necessarily mean literally, because of course there are other things that we need to be doing and responsible for. And then when we talk about ratios, right, like we tend to look at ratios as how we staff. Oh, well, we do a 2-to-1 dev to QA ratio, or we do a 3-to-1 dev to QA ratio. And I've been in many companies where my staffing headcount has already been determined because of simply because of the number of developers in there. And that's not necessarily a bad model, but when we aren't putting a lot of thought into that, it becomes a slightly dangerous ratio, because that tends to send the message out, well, as long as we are at this 2-to-1, 3-to-1 ratio, then our quality of solutions that we're delivering should be high because of this kind of, again, artificial or inflated type of ratio. So the ratio, the only ratio that I like is what we call the 10-80-10. And it really is looking at the bookmarks, right? So when we go back to our typical types of testing activities, where we're either planning or writing or managing the tests that we're eventually going to execute, whether we're going to execute them as a test case through a human tester, or we're writing them in this framework or tool, and it's going to be executed by the tool or the framework via the machine, right? So we're focusing on the scripted type of testing there, and then the end 10, the kind of the other bookend, is like the reporting on that. How much time do we spend on status reports, on summaries, on bug reports, on sharing information for folks that might not necessarily be on the project team? And so we have to give more information outside to a stakeholder or something. How much time are we spending on those? And so when we think about where should we really be spending most of our time, it's where that 80% is, or that 80 is. And so when you look at this, it equals 100, and this is kind of 100%. And again, this is going to be very unique to you. But the idea here is that the time that we spend organizing and planning our tests and the level of detail that we put on those tests, with possibly the exception of automation, but the time that we spend there and the time that we spend on reporting on those activities really should be much less than that middle number, which represents always be testing. That's when we're actively interacting with the software or the solution, both in an unscripted and a scripted manner. Unscripted being exploratory, ad hoc; scripted, of course, being the scripted test, whether being executed by machine or human. But that's the idea here, is when we want to make sure this is a good kind of guide. And I don't necessarily expect that everyone can get to that 10-80-10, but this is a reach goal. But you may be able to look and say, well, traditionally, I spend about 50 or 60% of my time writing very detailed tests or writing test plan documents. I may want to decrease that amount of time, maybe 20%, or maybe even 25% of my time is enough, but you've already gained 5% of your time back if you simply decrease that amount of time and you increase by always increasing that middle number of actually exploring and interacting with that software. And specifically, don't overthink it, right? I mean, this 10-80-10 is a ratio that, very high mature and very high agile, functioning teams. This is a really good ratio to get to, but it might not be applicable to you now. But the idea is those bookend numbers should be pretty much much lower than that middle number, because that's really where our value is within the team. So I do see a chat in here. Yep, 10 planning, 80 actual testing, 10 reporting. Yeah, and planning being not necessarily the planning of the actual Agile planning meeting where we're talking about the work that we as a team are committing to, but it's the level of detail around that test management, and specifically around those test cases, going back to my story of me spending an extremely large amount of time writing very detailed test cases where I could have literally cut that time in half and spend more time actively exploring the software. Cool. All right. Okay. So how do we fix the duplicating of testing efforts? Oh, I'm going to go right back to, okay. Yep. Sorry about that. I just wanted to make sure I cleared out that one in there. Okay. Go back here. Okay, so how do we fix that duplicating testing efforts, right? And so again, we're looking at making sure that we know all of the testing that's happening within our sprint, within our team, outside of the traditional testers that are on the team or tester that are on the team. So things that we should be looking at: unit testing. I'm always astounded when I ask the question to folks about what's the unit testing standard or guidelines? What's the code coverage? Where are those? What's the language? What framework are they using for unit and integration tests? And a lot of times still, the answer is, I don't know, or there is none, or I'm not sure, let me get back to you, right? And so one of the key areas of understanding if we are actually duplicating testing efforts is understanding what our developer and software engineer counterparts are doing on their own. Again, both the scripted things that we could see in that unit testing framework, but also what their own individual checks are doing. So if we don't have those conversations and we're not asking or we're not uncovering what they're doing, then we will absolutely run the risk of duplicating testing efforts. And the moment that we start duplicating testing efforts, different than redundancy, right? So redundancy is a known duplication, and there's a need for that type of redundancy testing that's different. We're talking about actually duplicating a test or a testing activity that has already been done by somebody, and we don't know that it's being done. So that's what I'm really kind of honing in on with the duplication piece. So we want to make sure that we're getting that and we're having active conversations and asking those questions about all the testing that's happening outside of what we as QE traditionally do. Acceptance criteria, right? As I mentioned, a lot of the times one of the first things that we tend to do is we look at that AC, and when we first get that story ready to test or ready for test, we start running through the AC. I like one thing that I think, quite honestly, I would like for QE to always be out of the business of needing to validate the acceptance criteria. I firmly believe that the developer who is actively coding that solution should be, just as QE should be, intimately familiar and understanding of what that AC is. And one way that we've had a lot of success is by instilling a demo. And this doesn't need to be the big demo that happens at the end of the sprint. Really, it's within a couple of minutes right after, as a parking lot issue from a stand-up. But when dev is ready to say, hey, I'm ready to merge this code, or I'm ready for a code review, one of the best things that we could have that developer do is just show how they have met that acceptance criteria in the story to the QE, the tester, and to the product manager before that code is merged. And we all know the longer that whenever we have to send something back to development after they've merged that code in, we've already kind of introduced a slight inefficiency. Not that we won't, and we're going to find bugs, and we're always going to have that happening. But When we're finding an issue with acceptance criteria where we can go through, each 5 of the acceptance criteria, however many a typical story looks like in your organization, and we're failing those or they're not passing, we know that we are extremely inefficient at that time. So one way that we can address that is actually have devs show that the AC is met to both the product manager and the QE, and ideally before that code is checked in, or implement that as part of the code review situation where that whoever's reviewing that code, if you have 1 or 2 approvers on a code review, that they're actually walking through the AC on behalf of that developer so that the AC is solid, we're all in agreement. So then when we start getting, as in QE starts getting that story to test, we know that the AC has been met and we can move on to better, more valuable things. And then a stretch goal here would be automate that AC, right? As part of our automation strategy is to automate that AC, and then we include that as part of a definition of done or getting to the point where we're shippable. But also automating the AC is one of the best ways to start including a regression bed. We know that the AC is so fundamentally important because it actually relates to the minimum viable product, and all of the ACs that exist for all of the stories that we are collectively working on to release, that those ACs really equate to the minimum viable product. So let's get that as close left as possible so that we can address any misses on the AC before that code is merged, and the developer can go right back to their local and fix them and make sure that we're all aligned, rather than waiting for someone further down the road, QE specifically, to test on behalf of them. So I know we have
Hey, Melissa, there's a question out there real quick.
Yeah.
And it popped up right as you were starting this slide, so I didn't want to interrupt you. It says, how do you handle this culture shift with the team? Team still asks if QA has signed off before moving code to production.
Yeah, I have pretty strong opinions on sign off, right? I think that the project team really needs to be signing off or giving the go, not just the QA. We overinflate the fact that we have test cases or scripts in a past state. And we tend to put that responsibility on one person, QA specifically, to determine whether or not we are ready for production. When we get ready for production, that really should encompass all of the activities that got us there, not just the testing and validation of those activities, right? So the culture shift is we can show one way that we measure this is if we, one place that we've done this is anytime when we move a card from, in development into ready for test or whatever that next column is that indicates to the testing team that they're ready to start testing. Anytime we find that an AC, for example, has been missed, we immediately kick that card back to the developer because we've established an agreement, an actual team agreement where AC must be demoed and must be aligned with the product manager before that leaves the developer. So we've kind of instilled that agreement with the team, and we can show the inefficiency when that's not in place. So when we see a card or several cards that keep getting kicked back to development because they're missing ACs, we can and should be able to actually correlate that to a time waste or an inefficient activity, right? And so the culture shift is that quality engineering, and this is where I really speak about quality engineering, because the quality engineer really is now setting themselves up to be the consultative person where we are experts in the testing component, but we're also able to initiate conversations around other quality metrics and pieces that we should be considering, like an AC, right? We might advise and say, this AC does not meet standard kind of acceptance criteria, like, is it demoable? Is it testable? Is it shippable? All those kind of things. And so when we can start showing where our time has been impacted because we're not meeting some of these extremely basic and fundamental, importance, like AC and code reviews and all that, we can, honestly, the culture shift really happens naturally because we can say, well, because we keep kicking these stories back because AC is not met, that means that something is not going to be tested. So the follow-up conversation is, well, I was expecting this to be ready for me to test today, and now it's not going to be ready for me to test until later today or tomorrow, and I've lost 6 hours of my time, and this is very, kind of rudimentary math here, but you'd say, okay, well, what am I going to do with those 6 hours that I thought I was going to have here? So something's going to have to give. The answer isn't, well, I'm going to have to work late tonight to make up for those 6 hours of an AC that's missed from dev. The conversation is, here's what's not going to get tested because I don't have enough time, capacity, or bandwidth for today until the remainder of the sprint. And that's really how those conversations kind of start or tend to result in. So kind of, moving back into being the martyr or being the enabler, right? So of course, I listed this before, before risk-based and context-driven approaches. I'm a firm believer of both of those. There's a ton of information all over the place on both of these types of methods. But as I just mentioned before, know what gives when the schedule won't. So, when we get to the point where, hey, we're running out of time, or we don't have enough time for me to actually complete all of the testing that we agreed we would do, now we're at a couple of junctions in the road. One of the scenarios might be, okay, well then how much time do we need? And we'll just extend the dates out there. That hardly ever happens, but that could happen. Another one would be, well, okay, well then the team will jump in, just give us a whole bunch of test cases and we'll start testing for you, right? And that's a decent approach, right? At least we're getting ownership of testing within the squad. But more importantly, when we use risk-based approach like this, we should know the areas that we should always be focusing on first, right? And that's going to go back to don't duplicate testing efforts, know what's being tested, focus on the areas that haven't been touched or haven't really been vetted out as much as some of the stronger areas. Don't focus on the AC because we already know that that's working and meeting expectations because we've already had that buy-in from dev to product and QE when they demoed that, right? And so the idea is when we get to that point where we have truly exhausted all of the remainder of the time, then we need to be able to have those conversations with our team to say, I don't have enough time to complete this testing. I am going to focus on these high areas of risk, and these areas won't be tested. What would we as a team like to address in this situation? So it's not QA or QE making the call or spending more late nights and trying to test everything. It's going back to the team and letting the team self-manage and make the appropriate decisions based off of the information that we're providing them. And that all kind of culminates into the be a musketeer, right? All for one and one for all. We tend to focus on the dev only or the dev complete. And as long as the code's there, well, then everything else will kind of fall in line. And of course, if you've been doing this for a while, that certainly never happens or very rarely happens. And really, it's being able to drive those conversations and to show our professional recommendation on where the risky areas are when we don't, or when we wind up running out of time based off of a lot of those other things that tend to happen there. One other way, and I'll kind of gloss over this a little bit, but of course, these slides will be provided, is the 8-10 sprint, right? So when we were talking about, if you're in the situation where, last 2-3 days of the sprint is when generally a lot of those stories come in. The reality is that, when we start looking at velocity and capacity, we don't tend to think about baking in or getting a body of work getting shippable. We really focus on being dev complete. And again, everything else will kind of fall in line later down the road. So when we look at an 8-10 sprint split here, and you can see the details here, we're really putting that reality to say, look, on sprints day 7 or 8, we really should have all story. Like we should naturally be looking at stories coming our way the first between sprints day 3 through 8. And that will give us the balance so that if we do wind up getting to the point where we're getting all of these stories at the very last 2 days of the sprint, that we're setting the expectation that dev needs to be complete within sprint day 7 or 8, right? So that we have enough time to finish the remainder of the stories and actually harden that work and get us ready to ship. So when we start thinking about things that we need to consider at the end of a sprint, It's, looking at, is this ready to be shipped? What are all the other things that we should have been talking about in order to truly refine this work, not simply talk about what the dev solution is going to be, what tests we're going to write, but what do we need to do to get this out the door and shipped? That really is where we're taking advantage of those agile ceremonies. And again, I have another slide that will talk a little bit about that. But as we kind of look through, the inefficient of QE only sprints or cycles, why do we have those? What's the reason why we have such a large regression cycle? Why is it only QE's responsibility to ensure regressions? As I had strong opinions on AC and some of the others that I shared, I also have a pretty strong opinion that, we as an industry, QA/QE industry, have kind of taken on the responsibility of ensuring that the developers or software engineers didn't regress anything in their coding solutions. And for some reason, we have just made that acceptable as that being our responsibility to make sure that a developer didn't regress in their solution. I firmly believe that the software engineers should be responsible for ensuring that on their own with guidance and help from us. So the more that we have automated tests to say, hey, developer, when you're working within this, this area of the code or this feature or function within the code, here are tests that you can use and execute, ideally automated, but even steps to ensure that you haven't regressed, right? And so pushing some of that responsibility back into the software engineer, again, where I firmly believe that is, but with some guidance and maybe even some shared responsibilities, we get rid of these need for this huge regression cycle where it's QA ensuring that we haven't regressed, right? I mean, there's a couple of things that I think we can improve there, but specifically putting all the onus and responsibility on the QA or QE around who's really responsible for ensuring that regressions haven't happened. I believe it's a software engineer responsibility, but I believe we can get there when we share that responsibility and transition them in there by providing centralized tests that allow them to validate on their own rather than giving it to us as a responsibility. So kind of talked a little bit about this, like how do we take advantage of the Agile ceremonies, demos? And again, I put a little bit I talked a little bit about this earlier, but before check-in and merge, I mean, this has been one of the biggest game changers here, because there's nothing worse than sitting in a demo at the end of a sprint where the first time that a stakeholder, or in some cases even a product owner or manager, is looking at the solution and they're said, well, shoot, that's not what I wanted, right? Or no, that AC is not correct, or no, we didn't meet the AC, right? There's nothing worse than sitting in there and now the team is completely deflated because they thought they delivered on something. So if we can shift that back and way as much to the left as possible, ideally before check-in and merges, we avoid that very uncomfortable situation of missing the mark and not really having that not being able to kind of mark that sprint as complete and successful because we have to kick back because we missed an AC or didn't interpret an AC the way that it should have been. So this slide, I'm not going to go through this slide as much. I'm just going to kind of leave it up here for you to peruse. But some of the things that, how do we take advantage of more of these Agile ceremonies here? Refinements and grooming. And in my opinion, other than the stand-up, a refinement or a grooming meeting is probably one of the most important, but not as it has traditionally been run, right? Like we know kind of what that looks like. It's the entire team. Sometimes it's like on our calendar for every week or every 2 weeks. And the expectation is that we're going to be able to groom 25 stories or whatever naturally represents a sprint's worth of work within an hour, or maybe a 2-hour meeting, or 2 hours per week or something like that. We know that that is never going to result in a truly refined story. So I like to encourage having short or smaller working sessions to where the folks actually responsible for completing a solution, both the development, the design, the testing solution on that story, meet in a much more working session where we're talking about, we as in QE is prepared, we're talking about types of tests that we are thinking about. We're asking what the developers and product manager might be looking and testing on their own. And we're actually initiating those conversations before the work actually begins. And that's probably one of the biggest, and in addition to those demos at the AC level and before that code is merged in, this is one of the other game changers where we have seen extremely optimized and efficient delivery because we've simply shifted a lot of this stuff to the left and before the work is started. So we're increasing the amount of talking and collaboration in a smaller audience so that everybody has the opportunity to talk and to share their solutions that they're thinking about doing and getting that feedback. But we also come back around and have kind of an additional layered or tiered types of conversations there as well. So we're really increasing the collaboration, which of course Agile is a huge proponent of. And we're having those as far to the left as possible. And we're checking in often enough so that we're truly creating those relationships in there. So in summary, here are kind of the finding efficiencies, right? And so we've kind of called out a lot of these inefficiencies: test planning, duplicating testing efforts, being the enabler, all that. And then some of the ways that we can fix them, and hopefully some practical ways that you might be able to take back and start implementing if you're experiencing any of these or some of these, or maybe all 5 of these inefficiencies, some ways to wind up fixing them and addressing those. So with that said, oops, I have this, this URL is actually not valid here, but I'll kind of open it up for some more questions too, if they're not already asked and answered. What is the 8-10 sprint? Yeah, no problem. I will go back to that one.
I was just going to read that to you.
You bet, got that one. And again, I will share these out as soon as I'll send these out. So again, the 8-10 sprint is that we set the expectation and the reality that devs should not be coding all the way up until sprint day 10. There has to be some baked in hardening and getting something ready to be shipped. So setting the expectation that out of a 10-day sprint, active coding is really going to represent, about 8 of those days, so that the entire team, testing included, is working on hardening and getting that sprint shippable. And again, the nuance there is you may choose not to ship, but you could at any point. That should really be the North Star of when we say a sprint is successful. Have all ACs been met and demoed and accepted by the PM or PO? And could this work actually be shippable if we needed to today? And that really, those 2 kind of components get us to the point where we're thinking not just, did I complete all my coding as a developer and did I complete all my testing as a tester, but did we as a team focus those last couple of days of that sprint really getting it ready to be shipped? And sorry, and I just realized I did not share that. So I apologize for that one. Let me go back to that one just in case somebody wanted to really kind of look at that one. Here we are. So this is what I was kind of speaking to. So really the reality of 8 days of coding, 8 days of testing, the first 2 days of the sprint for test or QE really should be focusing on writing and focusing on the scripted types of tests, and then preparing for those first stories coming our way so that they're much more balanced throughout the 10 days of the sprint. No, not, hold on, let's see. Don't code until the 8th day and give us things to test? No, actually, we're starting to code on the first day of the sprint, but we're stopping code on the 8th day so that we're not coding up to, so we're always going to have overlap or roll over into the next sprint. We really want to get to the point where we are focusing on high quality delivery that's fully shippable rather than focusing on dev and test complete. So we're coding from the first 2 days, first 8 days essentially. And then we're expecting stories to come our way starting on sprint day 3 all the way through 8. They may come our way on sprint day 1, but we know that our real testing activities are going to happen within, really sprint day 3 through 10 is when we're going to be focusing on. But those last 2 days are really kind of hardening up and just completing some of those residual tests. But really, the developers then are focusing on getting all of their code ready to be shipped rather than starting on the next sprint. We never want to have anyone on our team focusing on a sprint that's not already in play. So we want to make sure that we're calling out those very high value activities, like getting us to the point where we're shippable. Yep, exactly. And that comment, it was great. Exactly right. Focusing on the whole team approach is the key here. And that goes back to, be a musketeer, all for one and one for all.
Does anybody else have any other questions? I'll take silence as a no. Well, thank you, Melissa, very much for the presentation. It's very good. Thanks for everybody for joining. We have this recorded, so we'll put it out to to our YouTube channel, and we will send out information about next month's meeting here in the next week or two. So with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your evening, and hopefully a nice weather is going to start coming our way. Thank you again, Melissa.
Take care, everyone.